On the 20th of November 1943, the world was a canvas of infinite blue. From the rails of the troop transport USS Haywood, the Pacific Ocean stretched out in every direction, a vast, shimmering turquoise sheet under the oppressive heat of the equatorial sun. For a young Marine from Ohio, let us call him Private Miller, the scene was one of deceptive beauty. The atoll that lay on the horizon, a thin green line between the sea and the sky, looked almost peaceful. This was Tarawa, and on that atoll was a specific island, a tiny 2-mile-long fish-shaped piece of coral and sand named Betio. It was this place that would, over the next 76 hours, become one of the most concentrated scenes of violence in human history. The confidence among the Marines of the 2nd Division was high. They were the victors of Guadalcanal, hardened veterans who believed they were the finest fighting force on the planet. They had listened to the briefings. They had studied the maps. They had been assured that the naval bombardment preceding their landing would be the greatest the world had ever seen. The admirals had promised that the Navy would not just suppress the island's defenses, it would obliterate them. "We do not intend to neutralize the island," one officer had said. "We intend to destroy it." The Marines, sharpening their kabar knives and cleaning their rifles, believed him. They expected to walk ashore, but on Betio Island, a man of immense will and engineering genius had been preparing for this very day. Rear Admiral Shibazaki was the commander of the Japanese garrison. He was not a man given to wishful thinking. He knew the Americans were coming, and he had spent months turning Betio into what he believed was the most perfect defensive fortress in the world. He had famously boasted to his men, with complete sincerity, that it would take 1,000,000 men 100 years to conquer Tarawa. What he had built was nothing short of a nightmare. The entire island was a web of interlocking death traps. The beaches were lined with thick barricades of coconut logs, intertwined with triple-strung barbed wire. Behind them, a sea wall of logs and coral rose 4 feet high, a perfect barrier to crawl over into the sights of 1,000 machine guns. And behind the wall was the fortress itself. Shibazaki had constructed over 500 defensive emplacements, concrete pillboxes with walls 5 feet thick, reinforced with steel rails and camouflaged with sand and coral. He had massive 8-inch naval guns, salvaged from a sunken British vessel, housed in immense concrete bunkers, their barrels aimed out at the approaches to the island. Every machine gun nest had a clear, interlocking field of fire with its neighbors. To attack one position meant exposing yourself to fire from 3 others. Anti-tank ditches crisscrossed the island, and the entire landscape was pre-sighted for Japanese mortar crews who could drop shells with pinpoint accuracy on any coordinate. Shibazaki had left nothing to chance. He had created a fortress where every square inch of sand was covered by the guns of his dedicated elite Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces. It was a masterpiece of defensive engineering. But Shibazaki's greatest and most confident defense was not man-made. It was a gift from nature itself, the coral reef. Tarawa is an atoll, which means it is a ring of coral islands surrounding a central lagoon. The island of Betio sat on the edge of this ring, and extending out from its beaches for nearly 1,000 yards was a flat, wide shelf of sharp, unforgiving coral. At high tide, this reef would be covered by 5, maybe 6 feet of water, enough for a shallow draft landing craft to pass over. At low tide, the water level would drop to a mere 2 or 3 feet, and the jagged coral heads would sit just below the surface, waiting like a series of jagged, underwater teeth to rip the bottom out of any boat that tried to cross. The American invasion. Planners knew about the reef. They had studied the charts. They had consulted tide tables. They had concluded, based on the available information, that on the morning of November 20th, a favorable high tide would give them just enough water to get their landing craft, the famous Higgins boats, over the reef and onto the beaches. It was a calculated risk, but one they felt they had to take. They had made a catastrophic error. They had failed to account for a specific local phenomenon, a neap tide. This is a period of minimal tidal variation that occurs twice a month, and it meant that the predicted high tide would be much lower than expected. The water over the reef would not be 5 feet deep. It would be, at best, a little over 3 feet. It was a small miscalculation on a naval chart, but one that would have unimaginably deadly consequences. Admiral Shibazaki, however, had made no such mistake. He knew his atoll. He knew its tides, its currents, its reefs. He had built his fortress with the absolute certainty that the American Higgins boats would never make it to his shores. He knew they would get hung up on that reef, hundreds of yards from the beach, and that the Marines inside would be forced to abandon their boats and wade slowly to shore through chest-deep water, weighed down by their gear, with no cover for a distance of more than half a mile. He had built his fortress specifically to slaughter men in exactly that situation. The reef was not just a barrier. It was the anvil upon which his guns would act as the hammer. And so, as dawn broke on the 20th of November 1943, the two forces sat poised, separated by a few miles of water, each supremely confident in their own planning. In the American transports, Private Miller and 10,000 other Marines made their final preparations, the sound of the ship's address system crackling as they were called to their embarkation stations. They were about to descend into the Higgins boats, small plywood craft that would carry them to what they believed would be a battle-scarred but ultimately secured beach. They joked, they smoked their last cigarettes, their bravado a thin veneer over the dull metallic taste of fear. On the island, Admiral Shibazaki and his 5,000 men waited in the stifling heat of their concrete bunkers. They listened to the distant, low, guttural growl of the American fleet assembling in the darkness. They were ready. They were certain. Their fortress was perfect. Their natural defenses were absolute. They had no idea that among the American fleet, bobbing in the gentle swells, was a strange, clumsy-looking machine. An invention born not of war, but of Florida swamps. It was a machine that the American planners themselves saw as a curious, unproven experiment. It was a vehicle that wasn't supposed to float over the water, but to crawl through it. It was a machine that wasn't designed to be stopped by a reef. It was designed to drive right over it. Far from the war, in the quiet, sun-drenched town of Clearwater, Florida, a young man named Donald Roebling was preoccupied not with fortifications, but with swamps. Roebling was the grandson of the famous John A. Roebling, the engineering visionary who had designed the Brooklyn Bridge. Engineering, it seemed, ran in the family's blood. But Donald's challenge was not to span a river with steel cables, but to conquer the vast, alligator-infested wilderness of the Florida Everglades. The problem was simple. In the 1,930 seconds, when an airplane crashed in the swamp, it was nearly impossible for rescuers to reach the wreckage through the thick sucking mud and tangled vegetation. So Roebling, a wealthy inventor with a brilliant mind, set out to build a machine that could. After years of tinkering and several prototypes, he created a remarkable vehicle. He called it the Alligator. It was a strange-looking contraption built from lightweight aluminum to keep it from sinking. It was clumsy and slow on hard ground, but in the water and mud, it was a marvel. It didn't use a propeller. Instead, it moved using two sets of tracks, just like a tractor. But these tracks were fitted with special paddle-like cleats. On land, they acted as treads. In the water, they churned and paddled, propelling the vehicle forward with surprising speed and agility. It could crawl out of a deep channel, climb a muddy bank, and push its way through the thickest sawgrass. It was the perfect solution to a uniquely Floridian problem. It was a rescue vehicle, an instrument of mercy. Roebling's invention might have remained a local curiosity, a footnote in the history of engineering, were it not for a journalist. In 1937, Life magazine ran a photo essay about the amazing alligator from Clearwater. The article, filled with pictures of the machine churning through the swamp, found its way onto the desk of a United States Marine Corps general. The Marines, at that time, were wrestling with a problem of their own, one that was far deadlier than the Everglades. They were developing a new doctrine of amphibious warfare, the art of attacking a fortified beach from the sea, and their biggest obstacle was the gap between the open ocean and the dry sand, the chaotic, deadly surf zone, and the treacherous obstacle of coral reefs. They saw in Roebling's Alligator a potential solution. They approached him, and at first, the inventor was hesitant. His machine was designed to save lives, not to take them. But with the world inching closer to war, he was eventually persuaded to help adapt his design for military use. The result was the Landing Vehicle Tracked, or LVT. The first military version, the LVT-1, was almost identical to Roebling's final Alligator. It was an unarmored aluminum box, designed to carry about 20 men or a few tons of cargo from ships offshore, across the water, over a reef if necessary, and onto the beach. It was not a combat vehicle. Its armor was so thin it was often called a tin can, vulnerable even to heavy machine gun fire. Its only armament was a pair of machine guns, often mounted awkwardly. Most military planners saw it as nothing more than a glorified cargo carrier, a logistical tool for the later waves of an invasion, meant to bring supplies ashore after the initial assault had secured the beachhead. And that was exactly how they were intended to be used at Tarawa. Of the hundreds of landing craft in the American fleet, only about 100 were these strange, unproven LVTs. The main assault, the first 3 waves of Marines who were supposed to hit the beach and seize it, were all assigned to the standard Higgins boats, the very same plywood vessels that Admiral Shibazaki was so certain would become trapped on his reef. The LVTs were scheduled to come in later, carrying supplies and reinforcements. They were an afterthought, an experiment. Now, back in the waters off Betio, on the morning of November 20th, the experiment was about to become the only hope. The naval bombardment had begun. For 2.5 hours, a storm of steel rained down upon the tiny island. Shells from the battleships USS Maryland and USS Colorado, massive car-sized projectiles, screamed through the air and erupted in cataclysmic explosions of fire, sand, and coconut logs. Cruisers and destroyers moved in closer, their guns adding to the deafening chorus. The island disappeared under a thick, roiling cloud of black smoke and gray dust. From the decks of the transports, it looked as if no living thing could possibly survive. Private Miller, watching the spectacle with a mixture of terror and awe, felt his confidence surge. The admirals had been right. They were pulverizing the island into dust. Then the bombardment stopped. A strange, ringing silence fell over the fleet. The engines of the landing craft now seemed impossibly loud. As the smoke over Betio began to drift away on the morning breeze, the Marines stared, their hopes slowly curdling into disbelief. and then into a cold, hard dread. The island was not destroyed. It was scarred, blackened, and stripped of almost all its vegetation. But the concrete pillboxes were still there. The log barricades were shattered but largely intact, and the 4-foot-high seawall still stood. The fortress had endured. In their deep bunkers, the Japanese soldiers, deafened and shaken but very much alive, were already emerging, wiping the concrete dust from their eyes and manning their machine guns and mortars. The order was given. The first wave of Higgins boats, carrying the cream of the 2nd Marine Division, motored away from the transports and headed for the line of departure. Inside the cramped, rocking boats, the Marines were silent now. They gripped their rifles, their knuckles white. They could see the beach ahead, and they could see the reef, a darker patch of water under the surface. They were still too far away to draw fire, moving through a surreal, quiet lagoon. The first boat hit the reef with a sickening, grinding crunch of wood and coral. It lurched to a halt, 100 yards from where it was supposed to be. Then another boat stopped. Then another, and another. Across a line several miles wide, the entire first wave of the invasion was snagged, caught fast on the coral, 1,000 yards from the beach. The miscalculation of the tide was now a horrifying reality. The boats were stuck. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the boat engines straining uselessly. Then, from the island, came the sound that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. It started with a single machine gun, a distant, angry chatter. It was joined by another, and then another, until the entire shoreline erupted in a continuous, deafening roar of automatic weapons fire. Mortar shells began to arc high into the air, landing among the stranded boats with deadly plumes of water and shrapnel. The Japanese had waited for this exact moment. Admiral Shibazaki's plan was working to perfection. The trap was sprung. The ramps of the Higgins boats slammed down. The Marines had no choice. They had to get to the beach. They jumped out of their boats, plunging into water that was sometimes waist-deep, sometimes chest-deep. Weighed down with 60 pounds of gear, their rifles held high over their heads, they began the long, slow, terrible walk to the shore. They were completely exposed. There was no cover. The turquoise water of the lagoon began to turn pink, then red, as the Japanese machine guns, firing from their untouchable concrete pillboxes, began their grim harvest. The greatest amphibious assault of the Pacific War had, in its first 15 minutes, ground to a halt and turned into a one-sided slaughter. It was a perfect trap, and it seemed there was no escape. Aboard the battleship USS Maryland, a floating fortress of steel several miles offshore, Major General Holland Smith watched the disaster unfold through his powerful binoculars. Smith, known throughout the Corps as Howlin' Mad, was the commander of the V Amphibious Corps and the architect of this invasion. What he saw through his lenses turned his stomach to ice. He saw his Marines, the finest fighting men he had ever known, being cut down in the water, their bodies floating amongst the debris of their shattered landing craft. He saw the waves of the invasion break and dissolve against the unyielding wall of the reef. The plan, his plan, had failed in the most horrific way imaginable. The battle was on the verge of being lost before the first Marine had even set a boot on the beach. A communications officer stood beside him, his voice tight with strain. "General, the first 3 waves are stalled on the reef. Heavy casualties. They're asking for instructions." Holland Smith lowered his binoculars, his face a grim mask. There were no good instructions to give. Ordering the men to retreat was impossible. They were trapped. Ordering them to continue was a death sentence. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the fate of the entire Pacific campaign seemed to hang in a terrible, silent balance. Then he turned to the officer. "Send in the Amtracs," he said, his voice a low growl. "Send them all in, right now." Amtrac was the military slang for the LVT, the alligator from the swamp. It was a desperate order, a complete deviation from the plan. These unarmored cargo carriers, crewed by a mix of Marines and Army personnel who had trained for logistics, not assault, were now being ordered to become the spearhead of the invasion. They were to charge directly into the heart of the firestorm, into a role for which they were never designed, never tested, and certainly never armored. Let us now move from the cold observation of the command ship and into the hot, claustrophobic, and deafeningly loud interior of an LVT-1. Imagine yourself as a young Marine corporal named Davis, huddled with 20 other men in the open-topped cargo bay. The vehicle is a box of thin aluminum, and the roar of its engine is a physical presence, a constant bone-jarring vibration that makes your teeth ache. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fumes and nervous sweat. You can't see anything but the backs of the men in front of you and the sliver of blue sky above. Your LVT is part of the fourth wave. You hear the order crackle over the radio, and you feel the vehicle lurch as the driver engages the tracks in the water. You begin to move, churning through the lagoon, a slow, clumsy, and incredibly vulnerable target. Soon, you pass the line of stranded Higgins boats. You see the carnage firsthand. The water is littered with floating equipment, debris, and bodies. You see Marines still in the water, struggling forward, their faces etched with a grim, exhausted determination. You pass them, and you feel a strange mixture of guilt and terror. You are moving towards the source of the fire that is killing them. The chattering of the Japanese machine guns grows louder, more distinct. You hear a sound like hail hitting a tin roof, the sharp plink, plink, plink of bullets striking the thin aluminum hull of your Amtrac. The men around you hunch down lower, making themselves as small as possible. The two machine gunners on your LVT, exposed in their open mounts, begin to return fire, their guns adding to the cacophony. Then, you feel a sudden, violent jolt that throws everyone forward. The engine noise changes, straining, and a terrible, grinding sound comes from beneath you, the sound of metal tracks clawing at solid coral. You have reached the reef. This is the moment of truth. For a few agonizing seconds, the LVT shudders and seems to stop, just like the Higgins boats. Corporal Davis holds his breath, his heart pounding. This is it, he thinks. We're stuck. But then, something miraculous happens. The driver pushes the engine to its limit. The churning of the tracks intensifies. The vehicle groans, lurches upward at the front, and then begins to move forward again, slowly, painfully. It is a crawl, a brutal, grinding advance. The LVT is not floating. It is driving. It is climbing over the jagged coral, its steel cleats finding purchase where a boat's keel could find none. Donald Roebling's Alligator, the machine designed to climb the muddy banks of a Florida swamp, was now climbing a wall of coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The journey from the edge of the reef to the beach is the longest 1,000 yards of your life. Your Amtrac is one of a scattered line of similar vehicles now crawling across the reef, and the Japanese gunners on the island have turned their full, furious attention upon you. The LVTs are big, slow, and obvious targets. Mortar shells begin to rain down around you. You see a massive waterspout erupt just off your port side, and your vehicle is rocked by the concussion. You see another LVT 100 yards away take a direct hit from an anti-boat gun. There is a flash of orange, a bloom of black smoke, and it simply stops, burning its mission over. The bullets are relentless. They tear through the unarmored hull like paper. Men around you cry out as they are hit. There is nothing to do but stay low, pray, and trust in the driver and the clanking, groaning machine carrying you forward. The sound of bullets hitting the hull is a constant, terrifying drumbeat, a reminder of just how thin the line is between your life and the storm of steel raging just outside. But you are still moving, foot by painful foot. Your Amtrac claws its way across the reef, leaving the slaughter of the waiting Marines behind you. You can see the beach now, a terrifying panorama of smoke, fire, and shattered coconut logs. You see the 4-foot-high seawall. Your driver aims the LVT straight for a section of it. With a final, roaring surge of the engine, the vehicle crashes over the log barricade on the beach, its tracks biting into the sand. It lurches up over the sea wall and comes to a crashing halt on the other side. For the first time since the battle began, you are on the island. You are not safe far from it, but you are out of the water, and you have cover from the direct fire from the beach. The 20 men in your Amtrac, those who are still able, scramble out over the sides and drop onto the sand, immediately seeking cover behind the sea wall. You have made it. You are one of the first. All along the beach, a handful of other LVTs are doing the same. It is not an elegant invasion. It is a trickle. Many of the Amtracs are destroyed on the reef. Many more are knocked out as soon as they reach the beach. But some get through, and every single one that makes it delivers 20 Marines to the fight. Men who are not exhausted from a 1,000-yard wade. Men who still have their ammunition and equipment. Men who can now begin the grim, bloody business of fighting their way inland. On the command ship, General Smith watches the strange, clumsy vehicles crawl forward, a thin, fragile lifeline to his dying invasion. On the island, the Japanese defenders stare in disbelief at these machines that have defeated their perfect trap, that have crawled out of the sea like primeval monsters, bypassing the reef that was supposed to guarantee their victory. The Alligator from the swamp, the unloved, unarmored tin can, had become the single most important vehicle in the Pacific. It was a strange, clanking, and utterly improbable miracle, and it had just saved the Battle of Tarawa from complete and total failure. The sand of Betio was not the pristine white of the travel posters. It was a chaotic landscape of craters, tangled wire, and the grim debris of battle. For Corporal Davis and the few hundred Marines who had made it ashore in that first chaotic hour, the world had shrunk to the narrow space between the churning, blood-flecked surf and the 4-foot-high coconut log seawall. This tiny strip of beach was their entire universe, and it was a universe of constant, deafening noise and sudden, brutal death. They were pinned down, a thin, wavering line of men pressed against the relative safety of the seawall. Just yards in front of them, on the other side of that wall, the Japanese defenders were waiting in their interconnected network of pillboxes and rifle pits. The air was thick with the sharp, metallic smell of cordite. Japanese machine gun fire swept over the top of the wall, a constant, invisible scythe that kicked up puffs of sand and splintered the coconut logs. Snipers, hidden in the ruins of the palm trees that had survived the bombardment, took a patient and terrible toll on any Marine who exposed himself for even a second. The LVTs that had delivered them were now a part of this landscape. Most were hulks, stranded on the sand, their engines silent. Some were burning, sending thick, oily black smoke into the sky. But even in death, they served a purpose. These wrecked Amtracs provided crucial cover, their steel hulls acting as makeshift bunkers in a place where no other shelter existed. The living huddled behind the dead, using the disabled machines as firing positions and aid stations for the wounded. The situation was desperate. The Marines on the beach were an isolated pocket, a tiny island of resistance in a sea of Japanese defenses. They were running low on ammunition. Their water was nearly gone. The number of wounded was growing with every passing minute. Their radios, soaked in the landing, were mostly useless. They were cut off, and they knew that if reinforcements and supplies did not arrive, their small beachhead would be annihilated. Now, let us shift our perspective to the driver of one of the few LVTs that was still operational. Let us call him Corporal Johnson. He was a farm boy from Iowa who had joined the Army to be a mechanic, and he had been assigned to this strange new unit that operated these even stranger machines. He had just delivered his cargo of Marines, crashing over the seawall under a storm of fire. His vehicle was battered, riddled with bullet holes, but its engine was still running. Its tracks were still intact. His orders had been simple: land the troops and await further instructions. But there were no further instructions. The radio was a chaos of screaming, static, and silence. Peering through his narrow vision slit, Johnson could see the situation clearly. He saw the pinned-down Marines. He saw the hundreds of others still struggling in the water, trapped on the reef. He saw the Higgins boats, burning and useless. And he understood, with a clarity that cut through the fear and confusion, that his machine, this clanking, unarmored box, was the only thing that could bridge the gap. There was no grand order from a general, no heroic call to charge. There was only a quiet, grim decision made by dozens of LVT drivers and crew commanders in the heart of the chaos. They had to go back. Corporal Johnson put his Amtrac in reverse, its tracks grinding as it pulled away from the seawall and backed into the surf. The moment he cleared the relative cover of the beach, the full fury of the Japanese defenses fell upon him once more. His was now a single slow-moving target in the lagoon. But his mission had changed. He was no longer part of an assault. He was now a lifeline. He steered his LVT back towards the reef, his course a zigzagging, desperate attempt to avoid the mortar shells that walked across the water towards him. He aimed for a group of Marines he could see huddled behind a stalled Higgins boat. As he approached, they waved frantically, some of them holding up wounded comrades. Johnson brought the Amtrac alongside them, and the crew's machine gunners laid down a spray of suppressing fire towards the beach, trying to give the men a few precious seconds of cover. Marines, exhausted and terrified, scrambled aboard, pulling the wounded in after them. They were a cargo of desperation, their faces pale with shock, their uniforms soaked and torn. Johnson's LVT, designed to carry 20 fresh assault troops, was now crammed with 30 men, many of them injured, and all of them nearing the end of their endurance. With his cargo bay full, Johnson turned his vehicle and began the slow, torturous crawl back to the beach. Every yard was a battle. A Japanese anti-boat gun, hidden in a concrete bunker, had found their range. A shell exploded just off the bow, drenching the vehicle and everyone in it with a heavy spray of salt water and shrapnel. One of his machine gunners cried out and slumped over his weapon, silent. Despite the fire, Johnson kept going. He delivered his precious cargo of men to the relative safety of the sea wall, and without pausing, he turned his machine around and headed back out to the reef for another load. Again and again and again. All across the lagoon, a small, heroic fleet of these steel ferries was now in operation. The LVTs became the circulatory system of the invasion. They were slow, they were vulnerable, but they were the only thing that worked. They brought in fresh troops from the transports that were waiting miles offshore. They rescued the Marines who were stranded on the reef, and they began to bring in the supplies that were just as vital as men: crates of ammunition, cans of fresh water, boxes of medical plasma, and radios that would finally allow the commanders on the beach to talk to the fleet. Their most grim and perhaps most important task was the evacuation of the wounded. In the shallow water and on the beach, hundreds of men lay injured, dying under the tropical sun. The Amtracs became their only hope. A crew would drive their LVT to a makeshift aid station behind a wrecked vehicle, load it with critically injured men, and then begin the perilous journey back out to the ships where real medical care was available. For many wounded Marines, the most beautiful sight in the world was the ugly, box-like silhouette of an Amtrac coming to get them. The cost of this operation was staggering. The LVTs were never meant for this. The Japanese gunners began to systematically target them. One after another, the Amtracs were hit and destroyed. An LVT would be crawling across the reef when a shell would find its mark, and the vehicle would erupt in a fireball, taking its crew and its cargo of Marines with it. Others would simply stop, their engines destroyed, their tracks broken, leaving their occupants stranded and exposed. By the end of that first day, of the roughly 100 LVTs that had begun the assault, only a handful were still operational. Their crews, men like Corporal Johnson, were exhausted beyond measure, their nerves shattered, their vehicles barely holding together. But they had done it. They had sustained the invasion. They had single-handedly delivered over 5,000 men to the island, along with the supplies needed to keep them fighting. The beachhead, which at 9 a.m. had been on the verge of collapse, was, by sunset, a solid, if still precarious, foothold. As darkness fell over Tarawa, a surreal quiet descended, broken only by the crack of a sniper's rifle and the cries of the wounded. The battle was far from over. The brutal, close-quarters fighting for the island's interior had just begun. But the crisis on the reef had been passed. The unbreakable island had been breached. The perfect fortress had been cracked. And it had all been made possible by a strange alligator from a Florida swamp, and the incredible, stubborn courage of the men who drove it. The battle for Tarawa lasted 76 hours. It was a lifetime of brutal, close-quarters combat. The Marines, having secured their fragile foothold thanks to the LVTs, began the methodical, yard-by-yard process of destroying the Japanese fortress from the inside out. They fought with flamethrowers, demolition charges, and grenades, moving from one pillbox to the next in a grim, relentless advance. When the fighting finally subsided, an eerie, unnatural quiet fell over the island of Betio. It was a silence filled by the ghosts of the machines and the men who had perished there. The scale of the devastation was absolute. The island was a wasteland, a mangled landscape of shattered concrete and splintered trees. And everywhere, there were the wrecks of the LVTs. They lay where they had fallen, some half submerged on the reef, their hulls encrusted with salt and coral. Others sat askew on the beach, their aluminum skins peppered with thousands of holes. Still more were blackened, burned-out shells inland, destroyed during the final push. They looked less like machines of war and more like the discarded shells of some strange, extinct sea creature. In the weeks that followed, as the grim work of burying the dead and clearing the wreckage began, the American High Command conducted its own, colder form of accounting. They analyzed the reports, the casualty lists, the after-action interviews. They looked at the cold, hard arithmetic of war. And from the tragedy of Tarawa, one lesson emerged with a brutal, undeniable clarity. The landing vehicle, tracked, was the single most important piece of technology in amphibious warfare. The experimental afterthought had become the cornerstone of future victory. The numbers told the story. The casualty rates for Marines in the first waves, those who had been forced to wade from their stranded Higgins boats, were catastrophic. In some units as high as 70%. The casualty rates for the Marines who arrived in the LVTs were still horrific, but they were significantly lower. The difference was simple. The LVT gave them a fighting chance. It got them to the shore. The reports from the men on the ground were even more powerful. They spoke of the LVT not just as a transport, but as a symbol of hope. It was the steel ferry, the Alligator, the swamp monster. They cursed its lack of armor, but praised its stubborn heart. They knew, with a certainty that could only be forged in combat, that without it, the invasion would have failed. And so, the legacy of the reef began to take shape. Not on the beaches of Tarawa, but on the drafting boards of engineers back in the United States. The lessons learned in those 76 hours of fire and blood became the blueprint for a new generation of amphibious vehicles. The first and most urgent lesson was about protection. The LVT-1 was a tin can, a fact for which hundreds of men had paid the ultimate price. The response was immediate. Engineers began designing new versions with actual armor. They replaced the thin aluminum with welded steel plate, capable of stopping machine gun bullets and shrapnel. These new armored LVTs were heavier and a bit slower, but they offered their precious cargo of men a real measure of security. The second lesson was about firepower. The LVT had been conceived as a cargo carrier, not a warship. But at Tarawa, its machine guns had provided crucial suppressing fire. The planners realized the LVT needed to be more than a transport. It needed to be a fighter. Soon, new variants began to appear. The LVTA-1, the A standing for armored, was a true assault vehicle. It was an LVT with a tank turret mounted on top, complete with a 37mm cannon. They called it the Amtrac. It could swim to shore and then provide direct fire support for the infantry, blasting Japanese pillboxes at point-blank range. Later, the LVTA-4 appeared, armed with a powerful 75mm howitzer, a mobile artillery piece that could crawl out of the sea. The final, crucial evolution came from a simple observation. At Tarawa, Marines had to climb over the high sides of the LVTs to disembark, exposing themselves to enemy fire at the most vulnerable moment. The solution was revolutionary in its simplicity: a ramp. The LVT-4, which would become the workhorse of the later Pacific campaigns, had its engine moved forward and a large ramp installed at the rear. Now, the vehicle could nose onto the beach, the ramp would drop, and men and even small jeeps and artillery pieces could exit from the rear, using the bulk of the LVT itself as a shield against enemy fire. With these changes, the clumsy Alligator from the swamp had evolved into a dragon. The ghosts of Tarawa would guide the invasions to come. When the Marines stormed the beaches of Saipan and Guam in the Marianas, they did so not in Higgins boats, but in vast fleets of armored LVTs. When they faced the black sands and fortified heights of Iwo Jima, the Amtracs and Amtanks were the tip of the spear, crawling over the volcanic terraces, their cannons blasting away at bunkers. And in the final, titanic battle for Okinawa, thousands of these evolved machines would deliver division after division of men to the shore, forming the backbone of the largest amphibious assault in Pacific history. Each of these battles was a hell of its own, but none of them saw a repeat of the disaster at Tarawa's reef. The lesson had been learned, paid for in blood, and never forgotten. The story of the LVT is a testament to the strange, winding path of invention. It began with one man's compassionate desire to save lives in a Florida swamp. It was a machine of mercy. In the crucible of war, It was transformed into a tool of assault, a clanking, improbable miracle that saved an invasion. And from the lessons of its sacrifice, it evolved into an armored beast, the key that would unlock the island fortresses of the Pacific and help bring a world war to its conclusion. It stands as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most decisive weapon is not the one designed for the perfect plan, but the one that proves its worth when that plan falls apart. The one that, against all odds, just keeps crawling forward. And now, our story is complete. The roar of the engines has faded. The waters of the lagoon are calm once more. The memory of the clanking miracle and the men who rode it has settled into the quiet pages of history. Let that quiet now settle over you. The long journey is over. It is time to rest.